Chapter 2, April 21st, 1917. A neatly dressed woman stood in the railway station landing, waving a banner that said, "Halt the Hun." The crowd cheered as the Northern Pacific No. 3 engine began its slow roll from the station, heading west to Billings. Children clung shyly to their mothers' dresses, most of which were made of cotton, but some store-bought gingham and garbadine. Mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, friends and neighbors waved at the 7 young men on board. It seemed everyone in town had gathered at Forsyth Club in the Masonic Building that Saturday to show their support for the boys. They'd enlisted in the National Guard and were on their way to Fort Harrison to prepare for active duty and deployment. Speeches by State Senator Edwards and District Judge Crum, as well as rousing marches by the Forsyth Concert Band, had highlighted the send-off. The soldiers-to-be appeared eager to embark on their journey over there. Dr. Harvey watched the gathering from the sidewalk on Main Street opposite the railway station. During the week since the Forsyth Times-Journal had announced war resolution passes, he listened to patriotic declarations by townspeople in stores, the saloon, the bank, his office, and at church. It seemed even God intended for the United States to enter and end this war. The conflict had been enormously lethal, though mostly stationary for 3 years already since an archduke was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914. Few in this Riverside, Montana town had known where Sarajevo was, let alone what grievances might lead an angry young Bosnian Serb man to assassinate an archduke and his wife. Now, however, young Montana men were joining thousands more from across the United States to be uniformed, trained, and transported to trenches to join Allied troops and fight other young men from countries called the Central Powers. The train pulled away from the station and crossed the road on the western edge of Forsyth. The conductor sounded the whistle, warning automobiles and horse-drawn wagons to stay off the railway tracks. It seemed appropriate to Dr. Harvey for a train transporting men to war to blast an announcement so consistent with the nation's policy. "Out of our way while we make the world safe for democracy." He wondered how many of the eager young men would return to Forsyth and Rosebud County. Not everyone had endorsed a declaration of war. Montana's representative, Jeanette Rankin, the first and only woman elected to U.S. Congress, had voted against entering the war. She was vilified by many for her vote. Yet she, along with most all Americans, supported the mobilization needed for war. Still, concerns about sedition and espionage was fueling discussion in Congress, and among some on the railway landing in Forsyth. A week earlier, the Forsyth Times-Journal published a proclamation from the county sheriff, Herald Star, guaranteeing safety to foreign-born residents as long as they were law-abiding. It also promised prompt action against those who rendered aid or comfort to the enemy. The crowd began to disperse. A rancher and his wife and daughter strode to their automobile. They were headed home to their 1,000-acre ranch west of town, where they had raised sheep in the 1890s. After some drought years and decreased sheep production, they switched to grazing cattle and horses and growing hay and grain crops. The rancher irrigated the crops with water from a ditch he and neighbors had dug to take water from the Yellowstone River. Like other ranchers in eastern Montana, he had increased wheat acreage in response to rapidly growing demand to support war mobilization. Dr. Harvey imagined that before traveling to the railway station, his family had likely spent that spring afternoon tending to some cattle, a couple milk cows, and the beginnings of a garden from which they would harvest delicious beans, peas, carrots, and tomatoes during the summer and squash in the autumn. Most folks walked north from the railway landing across Main Street towards the buildings where most of the town's commerce and entertainment took place. These buildings were dispersed as if on a string east to west on the north side of Main Street, parallel to the railroad tracks. The laying of the Northern Pacific Railroad tracks near the south bank of the Yellowstone River in 1883 had led the establishment and growth of many string towns. These towns benefited from the reliable transportation while allowing the railway company to prosper. With a population of 2,100, Forsyth was the largest of the railroad towns between Miles City and Billings. As Dr. Harvey watched the crowd disperse, he thought, even the old-timers here are newcomers. Indigenous peoples had traveled and camped in what had become Montana for hundreds of years. 2 tribes of these people, the Crow and the Northern Cheyenne, now lived geographically restricted lives on reservations southwest of the southwest and south of the town. A century and a decade ago, William Clark and a portion of the Lewis and Clark Corps of Discovery camped near the present-day site of Forsyth on the return trip to tell President Jefferson of their journey to the Pacific Ocean. The magnificent mountains they had crossed on that journey were far to the west. From here, no mountains were visible, even from the high plains plateaus that rose 100 to 200 feet on either side of the Yellowstone River. But even the oldest of the large cattle and sheep ranches in this area was only a few decades old, and Forsyth established a steamboat landing in 1876 and designated with a post office in 1882. It did not become a county seat until 1901. Dr. Harvey recalled that it had not taken long to become acquainted with downtown. There were only a few blocks of it. He was standing near 9th Avenue in front of the Alexander Hotel, in which he had leased a room since relocating to Forsyth a year earlier that year. Like most buildings on Main Street, from 8th to 11th Avenues, the core of downtown, this hotel was a two-story building. Around the corner on the other side of 9th was a wholesale liquor business, and on the other side a mercantile store that sold clothing as well as hardware and furniture. Also on 9th, near Main, was a cafe. 1 block west at the corner of 8th Avenue and Main Street was the three-story commercial hotel, which advertised itself as a thoroughly modern brick hotel with electric lights, steam heat, telephones, and baths, as well as the only sample rooms in town. Although the Alexander Hotel might not have been as thoroughly modern as the commercial hotel, it was entirely adequate for Dr. Harvey with its electricity, telephones, and indoor running water. Traveling railroad personnel often stayed here. East of the Alexander Hotel was a pharmacy, a menswear store, a bank, and a meat market. Farther east, at the corner of 10th and Main, was a garage and automobile sales business. Still farther east, the Masonic Temple, with its square and compass emblem prominently displayed on the second-floor facade. At the edge of town, just 2 blocks east of 10th Avenue near Main Street, was the neoclassical courthouse, topped by a copper dome and completed in 1914. Among the first to cross Main Street from the railway station was a neatly trimmed, medium-built, middle-aged man who worked as a cashier at one of the 2 banks in town. He called out, "Good evening, doctor." "Good evening," he replied. "We gave our boys a good send-off today. They'll have the Hun on the run in short order," the banker said confidently. "I hope the war is over soon," Dr. Harvey replied, less assured. "Well, we'll have more boys ready to go if they are needed. We'll fill our quota when the draft kicks in." Dr. Harvey replied, "If I understand correctly, young men 21 to 30 years in age may be drafted. Do you anticipate volunteers older or younger than that?" "I think the boys who left today, except for maybe the map boy, were in the draft age group. Some might be thinking they'll have better chances as volunteers than they would as draftees later." The banker continued, "Now, Matty, he's just 18, but plumb convinced he's the best shot in Rosebud County. He'll need to be reminded to keep his head down." In turn, Dr. Harvey observed, "Some prominent physicians around the country, including Dr. Hune from here, as you know, have volunteered for the Army Medical Corps. Still, I suspect young draft-age doctors would be needed soon enough." "Well, I am glad you are more than 30, and I hope you don't go volunteering too. We need doctors at home as well as the front in Europe," said the banker, who had guessed correctly about Dr. Harvey's age. "I'm not thinking to volunteer," he said. "I'm more concerned about the Germans living here than I am about filling our quota of boys to go over there," emphasized the banker. "I don't think it's safe to have krauts walking around our town." Dr. Harvey did not reply, but thought of a German rancher, Hermann Muller, to whom he had provided medical care. Mr. Muller ranched west of town on several hundred acres of very fertile river valley land along the Yellowstone River. His parents had established a foothold on 160 acres of this land in the 1880s and subsequently managed to purchase additional acreage. By the time Herman, the oldest of 4 children and only son in the family, had assumed the lead role in the operation, the ranch had grown to several hundred acres. In 1916, stimulated by growing demand for grain crops, he had borrowed money from one of the local banks in order to purchase wheat seed and fertilizer. Now he had already become concerned about continuing increases in grain seed prices. and whether he might need to seek another loan for planting this year. The banker continued, "It's bad enough to have Rankin vote against going to war. How can our country protect freedom when we send a woman to Congress and she has a female hysterical fit? It's worse yet to have supporters of the Kaiser walking our streets." Dr. Harvey observed, "A half-dozen senators and more than a dozen representatives also voted no. They were all men." He preferred not to respond to the idea that neighbors might undermine the nation's war effort, and was relieved to hear another greeting. "It's so nice to see you this lovely evening," chimed the wife of the pastor at one of Forsyth's churches. "We are all so proud of the young men and so thankful to them for protecting us." She was a plump, middle-aged woman who was loved, or at least appreciated by, all for her tireless effort to support not only members of her Methodist congregation, but also those in need throughout the community. Then another voice boomed when a stately man dressed in a dark gray suit and a red, white, and blue tie joined the banker, the doctor, and the pastor's wife on the sidewalk. "Today is the day Forsyth joined the fight. I hope other legislators are seeing the same commitment in their communities, as I am so proud to see here," said Arthur Elliott, a legislator who had represented the district for more than 10 years. "It's time to address issues other than alcohol. Hasn't the Women's Christian Temperance Union done enough already? Isn't beer doubly bad? It's both alcohol and German." Elliott, who by his own telling was one of the most state's influential legislators, although characterized by opponents as exercising influence by being one of the least scrupulous as well, began to elaborate. "I'm in a position to gather the votes needed to—" He was interrupted by a horse-drawn wagon carrying several boisterous men stopped on the street near the legislator. The men were singing the national anthem out of tune and waving the American flag. The sight of the wagon on Main Street prompted Dr. Harvey to recall another wagon arriving here 4 days ago. That wagon, pulled by 2 sweat-soaked, rapid-breathing horses, had come to a quick stop near the sidewalk where Dr. Harvey had been standing. A frightened driver shouted, "Doctor, my brother is hurt. Please help." Dr. Harvey quickly stepped off the sidewalk in order to examine the blanket-wrapped bundle from which protruded only a shock of light brown hair atop a very pale, unmoving face of a 7-year-old boy. Holding the bundle was a thin woman about 30 years of age, with a distressed look on her otherwise attractive face. As he unwrapped the blanket, he quickly noticed a portion that covered the boy's legs was caked with dry blood. He glanced back at the woman. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded, "Please help my son. He fell. I think his leg is broken. I couldn't get him here any faster. Please help." Dr. Harvey took the woman's hand and asked her to hold her son a little longer. He then said firmly to 2 men in the gathering crowd, "Please help me get this boy into my office. Then take the horses to the livery for some water." He looked at the mother and asked, "What's the boy's name, and what is your name?" The woman wiped away tears from her face and replied, "I am Mrs. Swinson, Amanda Swinson, and this is Raymond." She looked at the young man driving the wagon and said, "This is my son, Axel."